Welcome back. In a moment, we'll examine the threat posed by returning fighters from Syria and Iraq. But first, here's some other stories to keep an eye on. Renegade soldiers in the Ivory Coast have rejected a proposal to end their 4-day mutiny over unpaid bonuses soon after the government claimed that a deal had been reached. The president has been trying to restore order after 8,400 mutineers took control of Ivory Coast's second biggest city, Bouake, closing border posts and roads across the West African nation. Cybersecurity researchers have claimed they have found technical evidence that may link North Korea with the global ransomware cyber attack that has infected more than 300,000 computers in 150 countries since last Friday. Experts are cautiously linking the Lazarus Group to this latest attack. It is widely believed that the Lazarus Group worked out of China, but on behalf of the North Koreans. Officials have confirmed a second case of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo following an outbreak of 17 suspected cases last week. The latest outbreak comes a year after the end of an epidemic that took more than 11,000 lives in West Africa. It's estimated that 31,000 foreign fighters have traveled to Iraq and Syria since fighting broke out in 2011. Numbers vary, but intelligence analysts say while many are still fighting, up to 30% have traveled home. Fear of returning fighters and the security threat that they pose is not a new concern, but a growing one. Here's Insight's Yasmin Hartoun Dewan.
Fighters have been taking part in conflicts well beyond their borders for centuries. In recent decades, Afghanistan and Israel serve as examples where vast numbers have traveled to take part in a war they have no national allegiance to. But it's the current conflict in Syria that has enraptured the world in its appeal to young Muslim men. It is thought that around 30,000 people have traveled to the country to join groups including Daesh, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham and the YPG. Travelling from at least 86 countries throughout the world, including the United Kingdom. But as Daesh weaken, a number of these fighters appear to be trying to make their way back home, posing the question to their governing bodies on how they should be treated upon their return.
Still with us is Omar Ashur, who is a senior lecturer in security studies and the Middle East politics at the University of Exeter. And also with us, joining us on Skype from Doha, is former FBI counterterrorism expert Martin Reardon, and he now serves as senior vice president at the Soufan Group, which provides strategic security intelligence services to governments and multinational organizations. Martin, I have to ask you, being with the FBI all those years, are you shaken by President Trump's firing of Comey, the FBI director Comey?
Yes, I think that came to a shock, as a shock to everyone, especially Director Comey. Granted, depending what side of the political spectrum you fall on, there's some room for critique on the way he handled the announcement about the Clinton email investigation last summer and again in the fall. But at this point, the FBI, led by former Director Comey, was right at the big push for the investigation on allegations of Russian meddling in the elections, and that sends a bad message not only to the FBI but to the entire U.S. intelligence community and, quite frankly, to Russia with this poorly timed firing of Director Comey.
Before he was fired, and some time ago, James Comey warned that battle-hardened extremists are coming back from Syria and Iraq. I mean, your group in particular has come up with those big numbers, up to 31,000 fighters.
Exactly, from close to 100 countries. But what's most striking is just from Western Europe alone, over 5,000 foreign fighters since 2012. More than half of them, approximately 3,700, just from 4 countries. 1,700 from France, about 750 to 800 each from the UK and Germany, and another 450 to 500 from Belgium. Significant numbers. And as many as 30% have already returned to Western Europe.
Omar, do you feel that the threat is overstated? Or, I mean, we've already seen some involvement of ex-fighters from Syria coming back and carrying out attacks in Europe.
I don't think it's overstated, but it's always complex. So you have on one end, we know that most of the attacks were locals. You know, most of the terrorist attacks that happened in Europe were by non-foreign trained extremists. We know also that some of the studies that came as early, I think 2011, 2012, were talking that the threat of a foreign-trained extremist doing an attack in Europe is less than 10%. So 90% actually either join basically demobilize in many ways.
Although 10% would bring us a lot of attacks.
Yeah, exactly. 10% would bring us a lot of attacks, but also we know that the know-how that they have, some of these foreign trained extremists, are quite high, and it's not like the regular training of a soldier. It's not a training of a regular army soldier. It's more training on urban terrorism, for making IEDs, counter-espionage. So very specific training for urban terrorism that can do damage
in a very short time in a populated area. It's a really good point, Omar. Martin, let me ask you. They've also had training in chemical weapons there, and do you worry that intelligence agencies are very concerned about the fact that they may be exporting that and may be able to carry out an attack in Europe or elsewhere?
There is a concern about chemical weapons attack, although when you look at the risk level, I'd put that at the lower point. The problem with chemical attacks, they have to be weaponized. And if these are homemade weapons, you have to not only cause a detonation, but you have to have a method of vaporizing and then spreading those chemicals.
Right. If that's at the low end of your threat, what's at the top end?
The top of the threat would be one, suicide bombings, and then also gun assaults. We saw in Paris, we saw in Belgium, we saw in Turkey. We've seen all over Europe in the last few years, all over the world, the gun assault and suicide bombings.
So, Martin, how would you deal with these people coming back? What do you think? The Danish government, and we've seen the full spectrum, right? I mean, some people say they're criminals, they're locked up immediately. The Danish government says, let's bring them back in if they haven't committed if they don't have blood on their hands, and reform them, help them with housing, help them with education. What do you think of the Danish government's approach?
There's a lot to be said about that, but I think there's not a cookie-cutter approach, so to speak, for how you handle the returning foreign fighters. It's country dependent, and every country is going to have to determine, based on their laws and their resources, what they can do. But there's a lot to be said about having an amnesty program for people, perhaps if they haven't actually been directly involved in killing others, and make sure they have a job, make sure they have some future, because that's a lot of the reason why they became foreign fighters to begin with. They're stuck in this place where they're marginalized, or the perception of being marginalized, with no future. So why not do this, particularly with Islamic State? The whole idea of coming in and you have this brotherhood where we're all in this together. So bring them back, and the program that you see in Denmark and some other countries, I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
I mean, I guess the problem when we talk about hard numbers, it makes it sound like we actually have a handle on this. Omar, do you think we do? I mean, a lot of these people will slip under the radar on their way back, and we won't even know they're back.
It's a range of estimates, so there are no exactly hard numbers. And all governments that I know of employ a bit of the hard approaches, so the legal pursuit, confiscating of passports and so on.
You're not a fan?
No, I'm actually in between. Like, it depends on what. I'm very pragmatic, so it depends on what works. So I know some employ the soft approaches, which is mainly the de-radicalization programs and the DDR programs in many ways. So that's fine. But also we have to know that we're focused on a very specific sample of the foreign fighters, the 31,000 to 40,000 ones. Those are the ones who joined mainly armed Islamist opposition organizations, Sunni Islamist opposition. But on the other side, we have between 102,000 to 178,000 that fights on the Assad side as irregulars, mainly inspired by the Iranians, and those inspired by the Iranian ideology and Iranian funding. And those guys are numerous in numbers, and we don't know what will happen also when they return, because many of them come from Lebanon, come from Iraq, come from Afghanistan, Pakistan, with very specific training as well. So they may create, or just stay in Syria, but when you have 100,000, 102,000, this is the size of the British Army, basically, British regular army. So if they stayed in Syria, they will certainly shift the balance in a very different direction.
Let me ask you both. Martin, let's start with you. Can you de-radicalize? Do you believe that can really take place, or is that some utopian idea?
It can happen with some people. I think when you look at your hardened extremist, they are ideologically driven and at a point where it would be very difficult to de-radicalize them. And those people, there may not be another recourse except prosecuting them if they return home. But for the people that are borderline, and that's many of the foreign fighters, they went there thinking they were going there for a certain reason, and then, you know, war is not what they expected, or killing other people not what they expected. They're not hardcore. Those are the people you have a chance to de-radicalize, the people that are on the fence. But once they've crossed, and they're hardline ideologists, the likelihood of changing their minds, not very good.
Omar, let me ask the same question to you. Can you de-radicalize? You've written a book on it.
Yeah, you can de-radicalize. The book I wrote was about collective de-radicalization, so how organizations, large organizations, decide to abandon armed activism and go to unarmed activism. But when it comes to individuals who are foreign trained, yes, we have mixed cases. We have foreign fighters who became actually politicians and joined the mainstream political party, or became like charity activists, and we know them by name. You know, George Orwell was a foreign fighter at one point in the Spanish Civil War, as we know. But we also have the ones who will very much be focused on a very particular side of the ideology, which is blow up civilians for political purpose and commit terrorist acts. And in that case, it depends on how much is their commitment and how successful will be on one end, the pressures for them to leave that ideology and the incentives to attract them away from it.
Martin, last question to you. Do authorities have a handle on it, do you think?
No, not as much, certainly not as much as they want, and that's why we continue to see attacks not only in Europe, but in much of the world. It's difficult. Part of the problem is the sheer numbers of foreign fighters and not having a clear handle on who actually went and then when we return. In the Schengen zone, people can travel, and it's fairly easy. They have a better handle on this, I think, today in 2017 than they did 2 years ago.
All right.
But it's a long ways to go.
Martin Reardon from Doha, thank you so much. Omar Shur in studio, great to have you again. We end with our Inside Bite, a little something that we feel you might want to know. Today, it is Soundwave, get this, tattoos. It is a new concept that allows tattoo artists to ink audio waveforms right onto people's skin, letting them listen to a favorite song or a loved one's voice anytime. The tattoos will rely on a smartphone app, which is currently being developed. But once these tattoos are in place, you can listen to your favorite tunes and carry them with you wherever you go. And just like the tattoo, you better like that song because you're going to have it for a very long time. That's all for now. I'm Dana Lewis, and that was Inside.